The smoke was already thick enough that I couldn't see the hallway anymore, just an orange glow pulsing somewhere behind me, and my father's silhouette filling the doorway, one hand extended toward me through the haze. For half a second, maybe less, I actually believed he was reaching for me. I remember the strange, fleeting relief of that half second, the way my body had already started leaning toward his hand, toward what I thought was rescue, before anything in me had time to register otherwise. Then his palm hit my chest and shoved, hard, deliberate, no hesitation in it at all, and I stumbled backward into the room I'd just fought my way out of, my shoulder catching the doorframe on the way down, the heat closing around me like a fist tightening. I don't think I understood in that first instant what had actually happened. Some part of my brain tried to construct an explanation that made sense of it. He lost his balance. He was disoriented by the smoke. He didn't see me clearly enough to know it was his own daughter standing there, because the alternative explanation was too large and too impossible to hold on to while my lungs were already burning, and the wallpaper behind me had started to blister and curl. Through the haze, coughing, my eyes streaming, I saw him grab my little brother Caleb's hand instead, pulling him toward the stairs with the same motion he might have used 1,000 ordinary times before, hurrying him across a parking lot, tugging him away from a busy street. And behind them both, standing just at the edge of where the smoke hadn't yet swallowed the hallway completely, I saw my mother's face illuminated in the strange, flickering orange light. She was smiling. Not the tight, frightened almost smile people sometimes wear in crisis, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes, that exists only because a face doesn't know what else to do with itself under extreme stress. This was something else, something warmer and more settled, an expression I recognized instantly because I'd seen a version of it 100 times before across 18 years of birthdays and school assemblies and dinner tables. The exact smile she used to wear when Caleb brought home an award, a certificate, a coach's praise, and I came home instead with nothing worth mentioning. Some ordinary, unremarkable day that never earned her that particular light in her eyes. I had spent years learning the difference between the smile she gave Caleb and whatever thin, distracted acknowledgement she gave me, and in that doorway, with smoke pouring around all three of them and my own throat closing from the heat, I recognized that same warm, satisfied smile aimed, impossibly, at the sight of her husband pushing her daughter back into a burning house. I don't remember deciding to survive after that. I don't remember a coherent thought at all. Honestly, just a kind of animal certainty that took over where reasoning had stopped working, propelling me away from the door and deeper into my own childhood bedroom instead of toward the stairs that were no longer an option. I remember the window, the one that stuck every summer from the humidity, the one my father had promised for 2 years to fix and never had, and how my hands found the latch anyway despite the smoke burning my eyes nearly shut, despite my fingers already blistering from something, a doorknob, a lamp, I still don't know exactly what, that I must have touched without registering the pain in the chaos of the previous minutes. The latch gave with a shriek of old, swollen wood, and the window swung open into cool night air that felt, for one disorienting second, almost unbearably good against my face, a sensation so sharply different from the heat behind me that it nearly stopped me in place, just to feel it. I climbed out onto the sloped porch roof below my window, the shingles still warm from the day's sun beneath my bare feet, smoke pouring out the window behind me into the night sky, and I remember thinking with a strange, detached clarity that the drop to the yard below looked like nothing at all compared to what was happening in the house behind me. I rolled off the edge of the porch roof into the hedges bordering our driveway, and the impact knocked the breath entirely out of me, sharp branches tearing at my arms and face, but even that pain registered as distant, secondary, unimportant next to the ringing in my ears and the smoke I could still taste at the back of my throat. I lay there for a moment, or maybe longer than a moment. Time had stopped behaving in any normal way by then, and I remember, dimly, through the ringing, the sound of sirens already approaching, because a neighbor 2 houses down had apparently called it in minutes earlier, while I was still upstairs, before any of this had happened, back when I was the one who'd smelled the smoke first and gone straight to Caleb's room instead of my own, shaking him awake, pulling him out from under his blankets, guiding him toward the hallway before running back for anything else, before running into my father in that doorway with his hand already extended. The firefighters arrived to find my parents and Caleb already standing outside in the driveway, in their pajamas, watching the house burn from a safe, careful distance, the kind of distance you only maintain if you already know, with total certainty, that there's nothing left inside worth running back in for. Nobody had gone back in for me. Nobody had even tried. It was a paramedic, running a quick head count at the back of the ambulance while the fire crew worked the hoses, who first asked, almost as a formality, where the second child was, a simple procedural question, the kind asked at every house fire with more than one child listed on the property records. It was my mother, according to the incident report I would eventually read months later, sitting in a hospital waiting room with my aunt beside me for support, who answered that question first, before anyone else in my family had a chance to. She didn't make it out, she'd told the paramedic, with a flat, settled certainty in her voice that the report noted almost in passing, a detail buried among dozens of others that wouldn't take on its full, horrifying weight until much later, once the rest of the story had come together. She hadn't said it as a guess, or a fear, or a desperate hope that someone would contradict her. She'd said it the way you state a fact you've already fully accepted, already begun, in some small internal way, to feel relief about. I made it out anyway, though not because of anything my family did. A different neighbor, the one whose yard bordered ours on the opposite side from where the first call had come, heard the commotion and stepped out onto his back porch, just in time to see me stumble half-conscious out of the hedges, my hands raw and blistering, one side of my face already swelling from heat exposure. He called for a second ambulance immediately, wrapping me in a blanket from his own porch furniture while he waited, and by the time paramedics reached me, loading me onto a gurney separate from the one my family stood beside in the driveway. My own family had already told the first responding officer a very different story, one in which I'd simply been unreachable, trapped upstairs by flames none of them could get through no matter how hard they tried. It took the fire investigator 3 days, working through the wreckage once it had cooled enough to examine safely, to determine that story wasn't true. The burn patterns along the stairwell banister, still standing despite significant damage elsewhere in the house, showed no scorching consistent with anyone attempting to climb it toward the second floor after the fire had spread past the point of safe passage. There were no handprints preserved in the layer of ash and soot coating the stairs that would have marked any genuine attempt to reach me, no evidence at all of anyone moving against the direction of the fire's spread. Just a single, clear, undisturbed path leading directly from my parents' bedroom to the front door, the exact path investigators would later confirm through Caleb's own halting, confused account that my father and my brother had taken together, hand in hand, while I was still upstairs fighting a stuck window latch alone. The investigators' report became public record 3 weeks later, once the insurance company's own independent inspector corroborated the fire department's findings down to nearly every detail, and once the local police department, reviewing both reports side by side, opened a formal criminal inquiry into what had actually happened inside our house that night. By then I'd had my hands operated on twice already, thin sheets of skin grafted from my thigh to cover the worst of the burns across both palms, and I'd spent enough long, sleepless hours in that hospital bed with nothing to occupy my mind except the ceiling tiles and the beeping of monitors to replay those 90 seconds in the doorway over and over, turning them over like a stone in my hand, until I finally understood, fully and without any remaining doubt, exactly what my father's palm against my chest had meant. Caleb, it turned out, hadn't understood any of it either, not at first, and in some ways his confusion in the weeks that followed hurt almost as much as the burns themselves. He was 11, 3 years younger than me, and when detectives eventually sat down with him for a formal interview, gently, carefully, with a child psychologist present in a small room decorated with toys clearly meant to make the whole process feel less clinical than it was, he described the fire the way an 11-year-old boy would describe something too large and chaotic for his mind to fully process. Confusing. Loud. Dad grabbing his hand and running. He had no memory of me being pushed, he told him honestly, because he'd already been moving by then, already being pulled toward the stairs, his back turned to whatever had happened between me and our father in that doorway in the half-second before he was hurried away from it. He cried, according to the caseworker who later spoke with my aunt, when detectives eventually explained to him, as gently as such a thing can be explained to a child, what the physical evidence actually showed. He didn't speak to either of our parents again after that interview. Not directly, not without a caseworker or a lawyer present, once the state formally intervened in the following weeks to determine what would happen to him. I saw Caleb for the first time since the fire about 6 weeks after it happened, once my hands had healed enough for supervised visits to be arranged through the same caseworker in a small, brightly lit room at the County Family Services building that smelled faintly of hand sanitizer and old carpet. He looked smaller than I remembered, though it had only been 6 weeks, his shoulders drawn in tight the way they got whenever he was scared of something he couldn't name. He didn't ask me right away why Dad had done it. He just climbed onto the couch beside me, careful of my bandaged hands, and sat there in silence for a long time before finally asking, in a small voice, whether it had hurt. I told him the truth. I told him yes, but that I was going to be okay, and that none of what happened was anything he could have stopped or should have felt responsible for, because I could already see, even at 11, the particular shape of guilt starting to settle over him, the same kind of guilt I'd spent years absorbing for things that were never mine to carry either. My father was charged with attempted murder and child endangerment, charges that felt, to me, both entirely appropriate for what had happened and somehow still insufficient to capture the specific, deliberate weight of 18 years spent as his daughter without ever fully understanding what he was building toward. His defense attorney argued panic, disorientation, the well-documented unreliability of human judgment during the extreme stress of a house fire, the kind of argument that sounds almost reasonable in the abstract, almost sympathetic until you set it against physical evidence that doesn't care about abstractions. For a while, sitting through pretrial hearings with my aunt beside me, my grafted palms still tender and wrapped, I worried genuinely that a jury might find that argument persuasive enough to matter, that 12 strangers might look at a father's fear-addled judgment and decide it explained away what the burn patterns so clearly did not. But the evidence held. The neighbor who'd watched from his own yard testified that he'd seen my father emerge from the house with Caleb, set him down gently on the lawn, and then simply stand there in the driveway, making no move whatsoever back toward the door, despite the fact that my mother herself, in her own initial statement to the first responding officer before she understood how thoroughly the physical evidence would eventually contradict her, had told him I was still inside. That detail, that she had, in fact, told him, and that he had done nothing with that information except stand and watch, became one of the most damning pieces of testimony in the entire trial, more damning even than the burn patterns themselves, because it eliminated any possibility that his failure to help me had been born of confusion. He had known. He had simply chosen not to act on it. My mother was never criminally charged with anything. Smiling wasn't a crime, technically. However much the memory of her face in that flickering orange light has followed me into nearly every room I've entered in the years since, however many times I've woken from a dream still seeing it clearly, that warm, settled satisfaction aimed at the sight of her own daughter being shoved backward into flames. She testified for the prosecution eventually, once her own lawyer made it clear that distancing herself from my father, cooperating fully, positioning herself as a bystander rather than a participant, was the only strategy likely to protect what remained of her freedom and her custody rights over Caleb. On the stand, she claimed she'd been in shock, that smiling was simply some involuntary, meaningless neurological response to acute trauma, a phenomenon her lawyer had apparently found some expert willing to testify actually occurs in extreme stress situations. She claimed she'd never actually believed I wouldn't make it out, that her statement to the paramedic had been panic speaking, not knowledge. I don't know whether the jury believed her. Not fully, not in the sense of trusting every word, though ultimately it didn't matter enough to change the outcome, since she wasn't the one on trial. I know I didn't believe her, sitting in the gallery with my grafted skin still healing tight and shiny across both palms, remembering with a clarity that no amount of expert testimony about neurological shock responses could ever talk me out of, the specific, unhurried, satisfied quality of that smile, so different from panic, so achingly familiar from years of watching that exact same warmth aimed at my brother and never once at me. My father was convicted on both counts after 11 days of testimony and just under 6 hours of jury deliberation, and sentenced to 22 years, a number that felt, when the judge read it aloud, both enormous and somehow inadequate at the same time, the way I imagine most survivors feel about whatever sentence eventually gets attached to the person who nearly killed them. I moved in with my aunt, my mother's estranged sister, a woman I'd barely known growing up because my mother had spent most of my childhood keeping her at arm's length, limiting our visits to obligatory holiday gatherings, for reasons I only came to understand once I was living under my aunt's roof and heard, slowly, in pieces, over long evenings at her kitchen table, just how clearly she'd seen through my mother's particular brand of favoritism decades before I'd ever had the language to name it myself. She told me once, gently, that she'd tried for years to say something, to intervene in small ways, and that my mother had frozen her out of our lives almost entirely as a direct result. Caleb came to live with us, too, eventually, once the lengthy custody proceedings finally settled in my aunt's favor, and the two of us built something quiet and careful together in her small house that neither of us had ever really had before, an actual home, unremarkable and steady in exactly the ways our old house had never been, one where nobody's basic safety depended on being fast enough, or awake enough, or impressive enough to earn a hand reaching toward you, instead of one pushing you away. My aunt was patient in a way that still sometimes catches me off guard. Even now, years later, she never once compared us to each other, never let one of our achievements outweigh the others in the currency of her attention, and it took both Caleb and me an embarrassingly long time to stop flinching, slightly, every time she praised one of us in front of the other, waiting for the old, familiar shift in warmth that never actually came. I still have scars across both palms, pale and slightly raised, faintly shiny in certain light, the skin grafts never quite matching the surrounding tissue no matter how many follow-up procedures the surgeons have run over the years. I catch people glancing at my hand sometimes, in grocery store checkout lines, across a table during a job interview, at the pharmacy counter while I sign for a prescription, and I've mostly stopped bothering to offer an explanation unless someone actually asks directly, which people rarely do. Caleb still has nightmares sometimes. Even now, waking up in the middle of the night certain he can smell smoke even in a house with no fireplace, no gas stove, nothing that could reasonably explain the sensation, and I'm the one who sits with him now until the panic passes, the same way I like to think I would have sat with him that night years ago if the fire had gone any differently, if my father's hand had reached for me instead of through me. We don't speak to our mother. She writes occasionally, from wherever she's living now, letters my aunt intercepts first and asks, every single time without exception, whether I want to see. I never do. I think about that smile sometimes still, in the particular quiet of certain nights when sleep won't come easily, and I understand now, with a clarity that took years of distance and my aunt's steady, unconditional presence to arrive at, that it wasn't shock, wasn't some meaningless involuntary reflex the way she claimed under oath. It was relief. It was, I've come to believe with total certainty, the purest and most honest expression I ever witnessed of exactly how much of me she had always been willing, quietly and for years before that fire ever started, to let burn.